always knew my mother didn't love me truly. Growing up, she constantly criticized me, telling me I wasn't smart enough, wasn't good enough, that I had no chance of success. I remember coming home from school with a bad grade, and she'd simply tell me I'd never amount to anything and that she was ashamed of me. She'd laugh at my mistakes, humiliate me in front of my neighbors, in front of my relatives. I grew up feeling like all my accomplishments meant nothing, that nothing in my life mattered. Even when I went to college, she'd constantly remind me that other kids were doing more, and I still couldn't do anything. I worked 2 jobs to pay for my education, and I still heard that I was lazy and that no one could love me. I dated girls, tried to build normal relationships, but my mother always found a way to ruin my mood. She'd call my university dorms, inquire about every little detail of my personal life, and interfere in my affairs. With each passing year, I learned to ignore her, but it was impossible to completely block out the constant guilt and shame she instilled. After college, I landed a good job at a large company in Chicago. I was building my career, working 60, 70 hours a week, seeing every project through to the end, striving to prove my worth to myself and the world. My mother called whenever she wanted, often simply criticizing my career choices, my style of dress, my social circle. She never asked how I was feeling, never inquired about what was important to me. At some point, I stopped answering her calls and focused on my career. I bought my own apartment, then a house in the suburbs, hired staff when necessary, and built my life by my own rules. I thought I had finally distanced myself from her influence. Several years passed. I was on my way to a management position in the department, and we needed new office staff. One morning, I saw the woman cleaning my office and immediately sensed the familiar stiffness in her posture, the way she walked with her chin slightly down, the gaze that assessed everything and everyone around her, but with a hint of disdain. I walked closer and recognized her. It was my mother. She was sitting on a smoking chair by the window, wiping her desk with a dusty rag, and didn't notice me. I stood there, looking at her, and the memories of every humiliation, every word she'd ever said to me, replayed in my head. I felt my heart clench, but at the same time, a strange anger and a sense of power were growing. She'd become the cleaning lady here, and now I was her boss, the person who decided where she worked and what she did. At first, I tried to act calmly, not to show my emotions, but with each passing day, it became more and more difficult. Every time I saw her gliding through the office with a bucket and a rag, I remembered how she'd laughed at my attempts to learn to drive, how she declared I'd never be able to have a family, how she'd ridiculed my school drawings. There was a strange sense of satisfaction, mingled with bitterness. I could give her directions, I could control her schedule, I could tell her where to go and what to do, and she couldn't object. But at the same time, I felt uneasy, as if I were breaking some very deep, informal rule of life. I began to notice that she had changed. Mom was older, she looked tired, her eyes had lost the hardness she used against me. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me out of the corner of her eye, and there would flicker something in her gaze I'd never seen before, a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She certainly didn't apologize or show weakness directly, but it seemed to me that she was struggling. I tried not to think about the past and focus on work, but every day reminded me of those years when she humiliated me for no reason. I began to notice small details, the way she flapped her hands, the quiet snort she gave when she passed colleagues I respected. I had a strange urge to talk to her, but the words stuck somewhere in my throat. I saw her almost every day and couldn't shake the feeling of both power and pain. Sometimes I stayed after work, watching her finish cleaning, and remembered how many years I had struggled with feelings of inadequacy. I began to plan what I would do next, how to navigate the situation without losing control or completely destroying myself. My life had been stressful, but now that my mother was close and dependent on me, for the first time I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. I knew I could build a new relationship with her or continue to exercise power. Sometimes I heard her whisper quietly to herself when no one was listening, and I felt that this person who had once been my tormentor was now vulnerable. It's a strange feeling, like the universe is giving you a chance to replay the past, but you don't know if you can pull it off. At times, I caught myself staring at her for too long, studying her movements, trying to figure out if she'd truly changed. There were moments of irritation as I watched her slowly scrub the floors, and I silently believed that this was her well-deserved fate. There were moments of anxiety as she paused, looked at me, and I realized that something was reflected in her eyes that I couldn't read. I wondered what she thought of me now, so many years after we had drifted apart emotionally. I felt a mixture of anger and a strange pity. I realized that I couldn't completely erase the past, but I also couldn't completely destroy who she was now. Every day felt like a balancing act between power and memories, between humiliation and the opportunity to start something new. I was beginning to realize that I had to make a decision about how to build our relationship going forward, because keeping everything bottled up had become too much, and continuing to humiliate her in my thoughts was also unsettling. I didn't know whether to approach her and say something directly, or to continue watching until she left, or to exploit the situation for my own gain. There was a storm inside me, and it grew stronger every day. Ever since my mother started cleaning my office, every day had become a challenge, and I began to see her in a new perspective. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the old memories. Sometimes I'd notice her walking slowly past my office, her bucket scraping on the floor, and in her gait, in her habit of looking down, as if always afraid of being caught doing something insignificant, I recognized the same woman who, since childhood, had shaped my sense of my own insignificance. I remembered every morning when I woke up and heard her voice, filling the house with coldness and sarcasm, when she told me I wasn't smart enough, that my friends were stupid, and that I myself would be lonely and miserable. Sometimes it seemed as if these memories were coming to life right there in the office, and that she was trying to make me feel guilty again, only now I held myself differently. One of those days, I watched her wipe down the tables in the conference room. Her movements were slow, careful, but her eyes constantly darted around the room, assessing, checking. I remembered her doing the same thing when she checked my homework, when she made sure I didn't stray even for a moment from the right things I was doing. I realized that her habits hadn't disappeared, that they had become part of her character, and were now showing up in her work. I remembered how she had once changed my entire mood for the day because I'd misplaced a plate in the sink, as if it were a catastrophic act. I noticed the same focus on detail, the same hidden criticism, flickering in her gaze, and for a second the old anxiety reawakened within me. I knew she was vulnerable now, but also wary, and this feeling made me tense. Sometimes I caught myself lingering on her gaze too long, as if trying to read her thoughts, and I had to look away to hide my hesitation. The next morning, when I walked into the office, my mother was already standing by the front door, a rag in her hand, her gaze downcast, as if I could judge her with a single glance. I remembered how she used to do this to me as a child, standing in the doorway, assessing my every step, every movement. I walked past, and for a second the thought flashed through my mind that I was 17 again, that I was once again afraid of her wrath, even though now I was an adult, a leader, and she depended on me. But the feeling of anxiety didn't go away. It kept me on edge. Every time she started mopping the floors in my office, I saw it not as just cleaning, but as a strange repetition of our old roles, me watching, controlling, and her trying not to irritate me to act correctly. Sometimes it seemed to me that she deliberately hesitated, to test my patience, to feel the power I could use against her. At times like these, I remembered her doing something similar as a child, giving me too much homework in the evening, knowing I'd be tired, so she could show me later that I couldn't handle it. I caught myself thinking it was almost a game between us, and it was both infuriating and fascinating. One day, while watching her wash the windows, I remembered an incident when I was 10 years old. I came home from school, proud of my first A in math, and she looked at me with an expression as if I'd done something terrible. She said that an A was nothing, that it was just a fluke, and that I shouldn't be proud because I would never achieve anything significant. In that moment, for the first time, I felt that all my efforts were meaningless, that love and support were impossible. Now, standing and watching her carefully run a rag across the glass, I felt a strange combination of pain and satisfaction. The pain of old wounds reopened, and the satisfaction of now seeing her weakness, of now being in control. Another day, I noticed her lingering on the stairs, dusting the windowsill, and for a moment her gaze met mine. I saw fear mixed with caution, and remembered how I dreaded her reaction when I'd forgotten to put away toys or do my homework on time. I felt these memories had become a part of us both. She carried them with her as much as I did. Sometimes I tried to focus on work and ignore her presence, but every sound of a bucket, every creak of the floor, took me back to my days as a child. I'd see her moving around the office, checking on the employees' desks, and I'd remember her checking my desk in school, pulling out notebooks, criticizing my handwriting, correcting mistakes, as if I had no right to independence. I understood that this wasn't just a habit. It was her way of feeling in control, and now that control had become part of the office dynamic. Only this time I could respond. Sometimes I'd catch myself inventing little tests for her, little instructions, to feel the power she once had over me. I felt both awkward and excited that she was now dependent on me, and this feeling gave me a strange pleasure. But at the same time, I understood that every thought, every glance was a test for myself, a check to see if I could be better than her or if I would be stuck in old feelings of anger and revenge. At times, I tried to speak to her directly, but the words stuck somewhere in my chest. I saw her fatigue, saw how she slowed down, how hard she struggled with cleaning, and suddenly a mixture of feelings arose within me. Pity, irritation, mistrust, memories of old grievances. Every interaction became a test. How long could I maintain my composure when she accidentally did something slower or differently than I expected? Sometimes it seemed like we were playing a silent game. Who would show emotion first? Who would give in? Who would break? I understood that these days could last for months, maybe even years, and that each new morning brought with it an opportunity to understand her, to understand myself, and to decide whether I could ever let go of the old pain or whether I would use it against her, reliving the past, but from an adult perspective, with all the power I now possess. Every time I close the office door and hear her continue cleaning, I understand that our old roles will never completely disappear, that we continue to interact through habits and memories, and that this play of power, pain, and anxiety is only just beginning. I could never have imagined my mother as a cleaning lady in my office. Throughout my childhood, she held her head high, her voice full of disdain and authority, as if the world revolved around her and no one had the right to contradict her. I saw her as strong, unwavering, terrifying in her criticism and injustice. And now she glides around my office with a bucket and a rag, quietly, as if afraid of my every glance, as if our roles had reversed, and this feeling of strange power over her simultaneously excites and irritates me. I tried to keep my distance, to observe her, to analyze every gesture, every movement, to catch childhood habits in her behavior, and every day they came across me like reminders of old wounds. But today something broke inside me. I saw how she left marks on the table, missed a corner of the floor, and instead of the usual calm control, an internal tension overwhelmed me. I approached her, stopped next to her, and for the first time in many years, allowed myself to say out loud what was clenching me from within. I spoke of every humiliation, of every word she threw like knives, of how she destroyed my childhood and my self-confidence. Word by word, I expressed everything that had been building up for years: fears, resentments, anger. She listened without interrupting, merely looking at me with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her eyes widened, revealing a look I'd never expected, fear of what her own son might evoke. Occasionally, I noticed her chin tremble, and I realized she was, for the first time in a vulnerable position, the very same one I'd found myself in throughout my childhood. I told her I'd never imagined she'd become a cleaner, that it seemed like a paradox of fate, almost a mockery, that a strong, powerful woman who had kept me in fear and control for so long was now forced to submit to me, to do simple work she'd never have accepted. And every time she looked at me, I saw her trying to save face, to retain at least some of her pride, but it was hard and almost pathetic. With every word, a mixture of anger and strange satisfaction grew within me. I understood that I now had a power I had never felt before, a power that was a long-awaited but difficult feeling. But at the same time, I understood that the feeling of revenge would not go away immediately, that it would live within me for a long time, and this gave me a strange sense of control and inner justice. I remembered how, as a child, I tried to protect myself, how I tried to prove that I was capable of something more, but each time she egged me on, stripped me of my confidence. Now I can speak, I can express everything that has been building up for years, and she is forced to listen without interrupting. I saw in her eyes an attempt to understand what had happened to me, why I was like this, why I couldn't just be with her, why so many years of anger and pain had been building up inside me. I understood that she wouldn't change overnight, that her habits and character would remain, but the sense of power I now felt seemed to compensate for all those years of humiliation. And at the same time, I understood that I would not rush to revenge, that I would use this power carefully, slowly, so that she would feel the weight of her words and actions, so that she would understand that years of humiliation have consequences. I watched her as she tried to continue cleaning after my words, and I saw how every habit, every movement that once caused me pain was now becoming an object of my control. I felt a strange combination of satisfaction and anxiety, knowing that I could easily destroy her self-esteem, but I also understood that this was only the beginning of a long process, a process in which I would gradually, carefully use the power she once had over me to feel strong and fair again. I recalled the moments when she laughed at my childish attempts, how she broke my spirit with a word, a single look, and now I understood that I could make her feel at least a fraction of what I was going through. But I also knew that I was an adult, and my revenge would be calculated, slow, strategic. I saw her shoulders slump, her gaze become cautious, and this gave me a strange satisfaction, because now she understood that the situation had changed. I felt I could control her actions. I could watch how she struggled with her new role, how she tried to maintain her dignity, and this gave me a sense of power that I had lacked for so long. But at the same time, I understood that revenge was not just an emotion, but a process that would last, that I would wait, observe, create situations that made her feel the same anxiety I felt as a child. I saw her fatigue, her caution, and it simultaneously angered and fascinated me. I understood that I would never be able to simply forgive, that this role she found herself in would remind me of the past and allow me to slowly build a balance of power I had never felt before. Every day, when I close the office door and hear her continue cleaning, I understand that the game has begun, that the old roles have switched, but the wounds of the past are still alive, that I will never be able to fully let go of the resentment, and that the feeling of revenge will be a long-term companion, slowly scrolling through every interaction, every meeting, every word between us. And I understand that my power now is not simply control over her actions, but control over the memories with which she filled my life, and that this power will be my long-term, hidden strategy that will slowly, day by day, show her that the past has not passed without a trace. When I realized that our history with my mother was no longer limited to the office, I felt the tension shift to a new level. It all started when one of my colleagues, who happened to notice my mother working as a cleaner, told her friend, who then told another coworker. Soon, the news spread throughout the department, and it became the subject of quiet conversations, glances, and pointed comments. I felt awkward and strange because I didn't think anyone else would be drawn into our story. I saw the employees glance warily at Mom and then at me, as if assessing the danger of the situation for their own jobs. I knew they were talking about us behind our backs, that it was only a matter of time before word spread to family or friends, and in that moment, I felt a sense of unease I hadn't felt since she first showed up at the office. A few days later, I received a call from my aunt, my mother's sister. She said she'd heard an unusual story about Mom and asked if it was true. I felt my heart tighten, and old anger and irritation welled up in my chest. On the one hand, I was glad that I could finally show Mom the consequences of her past actions, that now she was forced to face reality, that her status had fallen so far that her relatives saw her differently. On the other hand, I felt ashamed and embarrassed in front of my aunt and my relatives, who knew nothing of our complicated history. I answered evenly, trying not to show my emotions, but old feelings were seething inside me: resentment, anger, mistrust. I remembered how, as a child, my aunt and other relatives always sided with my mother, considering me too sensitive, weak, and incompetent. Now it all came back to me, but the situation was strange. I was an adult, a successful person, and she was a cleaning lady, and this gave me a sense of power mixed with inner anxiety. The next day, my mother came to work as usual. I saw that she was tense, cautious, as if aware that her status was being discussed. I watched her slowly walk past the employees, shaking a rag, quietly apologizing for every little thing. And in that moment, I realized that her inner humility was not only a consequence of her job as a cleaning lady, but also the knowledge that her personal life was now under the close scrutiny of her relatives. I felt both anger and satisfaction. Anger for the past, for the years of humiliation, and satisfaction that she was now forced to face a new reality. That evening, I was talking to a childhood friend who hadn't seen my mother or me in a long time. He said he'd heard from others that my mother was now working as a cleaner in my office and asked how I felt about it. I felt a strange tension. I wanted to tell the truth, to show that this wasn't an accident, that it was a consequence of her behavior, but at the same time, I didn't want to reveal my deepest emotions. I simply said that it was a job, and we both fulfilled our responsibilities, but deep down I knew it was only part of a long process. A few days later, my aunt came to our house. She looked at my mother with surprise and caution, occasionally glancing at me, trying to understand how we were getting along. I saw how my mother tried to act calm and orderly, but her shoulders were tense, her voice trembled when she spoke. I watched this silently, feeling old grievances and pain intertwine with the current situation, creating a strange mixture of emotions: anger, anxiety, a sense of power, and even, to some extent, pity. I understood that my relatives perceived us differently than before, that this created additional pressure that could be exploited. And at the same time, it made me value my own caution and strategy even more. I began to notice how my mother was gradually realizing that her past had not passed without a trace, that her behavior had left a mark not only on me, but also on how others viewed her now. She was no longer a powerful woman who could criticize anyone. Now she submitted to circumstances and to me. Every time I saw her gaze, I understood that revenge was not a one-time act, but a long process, and that this situation with my relatives strengthened my sense of control and inner satisfaction. But at the same time, I understood that I couldn't completely destroy her psyche, that I had to act carefully, observe, evaluate every movement, every word. I remembered my childhood, how she stood over me with her head held high, how her every word was a test, how every glance made me doubt myself. And now I saw how she tried to hold herself together, how carefully she walked around the house, how quietly she spoke so as not to provoke a reaction. I knew my revenge strategy would be long-term, that I would exploit her weaknesses and habits to remind her of the past, slowly, day after day, through every interaction. A few days later, a relative asked me frankly, "Aren't you too hard on her?" I felt the old pain, anger, and sense of justice flare up inside me again. I didn't try to justify myself, because I understood that this wasn't a matter of explanations, but a matter of inner balance. She had chosen her own path, and now the consequences of her actions were becoming clear. I began to see how my mother reacted to every glance from relatives, how the tension escalated, how her childhood habits resurfaced, but now under my control. I understood that her every step, every action was a test for me, a test of how much composure and strategy I could maintain, how long I could allow myself to test my power without completely destroying everything. And I felt like this story wouldn't end quickly, that old wounds and revenge would live on within me for a long time, that every new day with my mother would be a test, a balancing act between power, memories, and inner satisfaction. Every word, every action of my relatives, every glance from my mother only increased the tension and made me more attentive, more cautious. And I understood that many steps still lay ahead to fully assess the consequences of our past and present, to slowly, day by day, remind my mother that power can be wielded by anyone, and that her past had left a mark that she now felt every day. I knew this wasn't the end, that the game was just beginning, and that feelings of revenge, control, and old grievances would slowly but surely shape our new reality. I never thought I'd ever notice anything resembling concern for me and my mother, much less in the office. It was so strange that for the first few seconds, I couldn't believe my eyes. It all started the day our department experienced a minor crisis. One of our employees accidentally spilled coffee on important documents, and the situation required a quick solution. I was standing at the desk, trying to figure out how to fix the situation, when I noticed my mother, seemingly unwilling to intervene, approach and quietly offer to help. I initially ignored her, because in my eyes, she was a cleaning lady, part of the office background, not a participant in the work processes. But she carefully picked up several documents and quickly, and without further ado helped me gather them, all the while exercising such care that not a single movement seemed provocative. I saw something strange in this, the usual neatness, which had previously seemed to me merely a manifestation of control or criticism, now transformed into real, concrete help. I stood nearby and tried to understand my feelings. On the one hand, I felt an internal irritation. How dare she interfere, as if she could make my work easier? On the other hand, I understood that her actions were genuinely helpful, and this created a contradiction within me. I remembered my childhood, how she always pointed out that I couldn't do anything right, how she laughed at my attempts, how she destroyed my confidence. And now she was doing something useful quietly without pride or mockery. I noticed how her gaze slid around the room, checking that no one was watching, how she didn't try to emphasize her concern, as if she were afraid to admit that she was doing something for me. This evoked a strange feeling in me, a mixture of suspicion, surprise, and irritation. I didn't know how to react, and for several minutes I simply stood, watching her. I caught every movement, every touch of the documents, every glance, and I realized that for the first time in many years, she was doing something not for herself, not for her own power, but for me. I felt a storm of emotions welling up inside me. Memories of childhood, of pain, of those days when I tried hard and she only humiliated me. The feeling of power I had felt for so long now. And at the same time, a strange warmth that I couldn't acknowledge even to myself. After that day, I began to notice small things. The way she quietly sweeps the floor near my desk without distracting me. The way she carefully puts away the dregs of my coffee cup so that no one notices. The way she smiles slightly when I suddenly appreciate her efforts. It was both surprising and unsettling. I didn't know how to react to these manifestations. I knew I couldn't immediately forgive or forget the past, that years of humiliation wouldn't disappear instantly. But the feeling of being cared for, however quiet and slow, creates a new dynamic that I wasn't prepared to face. One day, when I stayed after work, sorting through documents for a new project, my mother came over and quietly asked if I needed help sorting the papers. I felt the tension in the air, her caution, my mixture of distrust and a desire to acknowledge that her help truly did make the job easier. I decided to accept her help, though it was difficult. We began organizing the folders together, and I found myself working side by side for the first time in a long time without verbal sparring or old grudges. I heard only her quiet breathing, the sound of paper, the movement of her hands, and it was surprisingly intimate in a strange, painful way. Every gesture she made, every attempt to be neat, quiet, and uncontrolled, reminded me of how much she had once influenced me, and how I could now observe her without completely succumbing to old emotions, yet feeling a strange satisfaction. The feeling of revenge continued to linger within me, but now it was intertwined with a new element. The understanding that she could still be useful, that she was capable of caring, and that this added a new complexity to our relationship. I caught myself thinking that I could no longer perceive her solely as an object of control, that her actions were creating a new game in which I had to balance power, old grievances, and unexpected gratitude. At times, I saw her quietly look at me, as if awaiting my reaction, and I understood that her caution, her desire to help, was a way to test whether I could accept her without anger, whether I could control my emotions. I realized that this was another step in a long game we were playing together, where each new day brought new tests, new sensations of power, anxiety, and weakness. With each such situation, I felt the strategy of revenge continue, but now it was complicated by new elements. Care, attention, a manifestation of humanity that I could not ignore. I watched her carefully arrange folders, wipe away coffee spills, glance at me from the corner of her eye, and understood that this was all part of a new reality, where we both tried to find a balance between the past and the present, between power and care. Every day now brought new challenges. How to respond to her help, how to maintain a sense of control, how not to let my emotions take over. I understood that this would last a long time, that the sense of revenge that lived within me would be intertwined with new sensations, and that each new step my mother took was another test for me, an opportunity to assess how well I could manage my own emotions, how mature, strong, and strategic I could remain. I saw that she was cautious, tense, yet proactive, and this simultaneously irritated and fascinated me. I understood that our story wasn't over, that old roles, old grievances continued to live on, but now new elements had been added. Care, attention, subtle caution, making the game between us even more complex and interesting. Every new day with my mother at the office turned into a test of patience, of power, of the ability to see the past and the present simultaneously. I knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, that the revenge would be slow, the strategy constant, but now it was intertwined with unexpected expressions of humanity that I couldn't ignore, and this made our relationship simultaneously tense, intriguing, and real. I never thought this day would come so unexpectedly, that my mother, the woman who had been the source of pain and humiliation my entire life, would make a decision on her own, without my direct intervention, and that this decision would change the entire dynamic between us. It all started that morning, when I came into the office and saw her gaze, unusually serious, almost determined, her eyes no longer darting about as before, but focused on something internal. She approached and quietly said she wanted to talk after work. I felt a strange tension. On the one hand, it was a normal work interaction. On the other, I knew something had changed. I watched her all day, noticing every movement, every detail. How she carefully cleaned the floors, rearranged chairs, dusted the furniture. And I realized this was no longer her old habit of controlling or concealing something. This was something else, conscious work, but with an inner purpose. When the office emptied and we were alone, she came to me and quietly said she couldn't work here anymore. She explained that it was hard for her to be in this space, next to me, that every look and every movement reminded her of the past, and that she needed to leave to preserve at least some human pride and peace. I froze in place, not immediately knowing how to react. On the one hand, I felt a strange relief, as if the weight of old resentments and tension was beginning to lift. On the other, a mixture of anger, power, and inner resistance flared up within me again. I remembered my childhood, how she raised her voice, how she humiliated me, how she destroyed my sense of self-worth. And now she was making her own choice, without my orders, without outside pressure, and this evoked a strange feeling in me, a mixture of respect and irritation. I asked her if she was sure this decision was final. She nodded and said yes, that it wasn't about running away from me, but rather an attempt to cope with what had built up inside her, with what I represented in her eyes. I remained silent, watching her face, every gesture, the way her hands trembled, the tension in her shoulders, and I realized that this was one of the rare moments when she was completely vulnerable. Old emotions flared up inside me. Revenge, anger, satisfaction, and at the same time, a strange pity I couldn't acknowledge. I understood that this decision would change our interaction. There would be no more daily surveillance, control, petty provocations, and internal games, but the memory of the past would remain, and the feeling of power would slowly weaken. I began to remember how she always wanted to appear strong, independent, how she never admitted her mistakes, how she always strategized to keep me in fear. And now, taking this step herself, she demonstrates that the understanding of her own vulnerability came only after years of self-awareness. I suggested that we discuss the terms of her departure so that everything would proceed as smoothly as possible. The final days of work, the payoff, a possible recommendation. She quietly agreed, but I noticed a mixture of relief and fear flickering in her eyes. I understood that for her, this wasn't just a job, not just an office, but a symbol of her entire past, her mistakes, her control, her power over me and mine over her. We spent the rest of the day quietly, observing each other, and I caught myself seeing her as a separate person for the first time in a long time, not just as the mother who ruined my childhood, but as someone capable of independent decision-making, of making a conscious choice. After work, we went to a nearby cafe to discuss the details of her departure. She spoke quietly, carefully, without her usual mockery or attempt to justify herself, and I listened, trying to catch every word, every emotion. I understood that this conversation was the final test for both of us. Could I let go of some of my anger? Could I accept her decision without destroying my inner balance? Could I accept that revenge and control would no longer be a daily presence in our lives? I felt a strange relief and tension at the same time. We talked about the past, about childhood, about the pain, but without accusations or yelling. She admitted her mistakes, I shared my memories, and for the first time we could talk like adults, without the old dynamics of power and humiliation, although the internal control and resentment still lingered within me. I understood that forgiveness wouldn't come immediately, that old wounds would remain, But this step created a new balance. My mother was no longer the source of daily pain. I could no longer exploit her weaknesses for my revenge strategy, and this was both frightening and liberating. That evening, as we said goodbye, she quietly said that she was grateful for the opportunity to leave with dignity, that she hoped there would at least be a neutral distance between us. I looked at her, realizing that this was the end of a long chapter in our lives, the end of daily checks, tension, and little power games. But inside me, some of the old anger still lingered, some satisfaction that she had come to terms with the consequences of her past. I understood that now our relationship would enter a new phase. She free from daily pressure, I free from the need to control her every move, but the memory of the past would remain as a quiet background, a reminder of who we were and what we had experienced. I watched her leave, slowly, carefully, with a hint of alarm in her eyes, and I understood that my power over her was now fading, but I still felt a strange satisfaction. The game was over, the strategy of revenge was complete, though the internal control and memories would live on for a long time. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I realized that I could breathe freely, that I could leave the past behind. If not completely, then enough to begin a new chapter in life, where we both remained human, with our mistakes, weaknesses, and freedom of choice, and where there was no longer daily pain, control, or hidden struggle, only the memory of what had been and the opportunity to move on, each on our own path, while maintaining the respect and distance that we had been unable to find for so long.